This is the story of a man who realized that being home alone wasn't just about being by himself. It was about being completely invisible to the things living in the dark. Welcome to the Black Hour Stories. We promised you a true account of supernatural isolation, and tonight you're getting it. Eric thought he knew his house. He knew the squeaks in the floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator, and the way the wind always hit the west window just right. He lived there for 20 years. But on the night his wife and kids went away for the weekend, he learned that the house had secrets it only shared when he was truly, completely alone. If you feel like your house is listening, you might want to turn up the volume. Eric poured a cup of coffee at 11 p.m. It was Saturday night. His family was visiting his wife's sister 3 states over, and Eric had the place to himself. The silence felt heavy, but good. He sat on the couch and put his feet up. The only noise was the gentle tick-tick of the old grandfather clock in the hallway, a sound he barely noticed most days. Around midnight, he got up to get a glass of water. As he walked toward the kitchen, he noticed the tick-tick was gone. He stopped in the hallway. The house was dead quiet. Not just quiet, but wrong quiet. It was the kind of silence that presses against your ears, making them feel stuffed up. He looked at the grandfather clock. The pendulum wasn't moving. It had stopped right at 12:03 a.m. Eric shrugged it off. It was an old clock. Maybe it needed winding. He went to the kitchen and got his water. When he came back, he saw something that made the hair on his arm stand up. The front door, which he had double locked, was slightly ajar. The inside safety chain was dangling, unlatched. He hadn't heard a thing. No scraping of the lock, no click of the door opening, no sound at all. Eric felt a spike of cold fear. He was a big man, but the emptiness of the house made him small. He checked the locks again, pushing the door firmly shut, and then he added a wedge under the door handle for good measure. He tried to go back to watching television, but he kept listening. He listened so hard his jaw hurt. The silence was still total. Even the sounds from outside, the distant traffic, the occasional siren, the crickets were completely muffled, like the house was sealed off underwater. That was the first sign that the atmosphere in the house had changed. The second came an hour later from the upstairs bedroom. Eric was sitting downstairs when he heard a thump. It was a solid sound, like a large, heavy book falling onto thick carpet. He knew the sound well. It was the sound of the old dictionary they kept on the bedside table. He froze. He hadn't been upstairs since before his family left. Nobody was home but him. He stood up slowly, grabbing the heavy fireplace poker. The feeling of being watched was suddenly overwhelming, pressing on his neck like a cold hand. He climbed the stairs, moving carefully, trying to make his own footsteps silent against the unnerving hush of the house. The hallway upstairs was dark. He flipped on the light. The door to the master bedroom was open. He pushed it all the way in with the poker. The room looked normal, but then he saw it. The massive dictionary was not on the floor. It was sitting right where it belonged, on the edge of the knitstand. But there was something else. On the wall, just above where the book was a faint, dusty handprint. It was too small to be his. It was the size of a child's hand. He touched it. The dust came away on his finger, meaning the house cleaning crew hadn't missed it, which meant it was fresh. Eric backed out of the room. He realized that the thump he heard wasn't the book falling. It was something else hitting the wall and landing silently. The dust print was the last touch. This meant whatever was in the house was capable of making noise only once and then disappearing into the soundless vacuum that had taken over his home. He retreated downstairs and sat by the kitchen counter, the poker across his lap. He stayed awake, watching the darkness in the living room. At 3:00 he heard a whisper. It wasn't in his ear or coming from the next room. It seemed to come from the wood itself, from the very frame of the house. It was a cold, dry sound, like fingernails on a dry leaf. He couldn't make out the words, but the tone was clear. Mockery. The whisper sounded like a crowd, but only one sound at a time. It was a chorus of faint, dry voices, all saying something quick, before the next one took over. The noise was only present for about 5 seconds, and then the awful silence clamped down again. Eric felt his heart hammering against his ribs. He had to know if he was going crazy. He needed an anchor to reality. He went to the basement stairs and opened the door. Below the steps was a small window. He could see the outside light coming in through the small square. He listened. Outside the window, he heard nothing. No wind, no crickets, no far-off sounds. It was still total, deep silence. But when he walked down the first 2 steps, his foot landed on a loose board. Kriak. The sound was loud and sharp. Too loud. He realized the awful truth. The sound hadn't been swallowed. It had been removed. The house was not silent to the things inside it. It was only silent to him. Everything he heard, the thump, the whispers, were sounds that somehow bypassed the thing that stole all the ambient noise. He stood frozen on the stairs. That's when he saw the movement. It was not in the basement. It was in the thin space between the bottom of the basement door and the floor of the hallway. A deep black shadow, flat and wide, suddenly stretched itself across the hallway carpet. It wasn't a shadow from the lights. It was a shadow that seemed to be created by the lack of light. It looked dense, like liquid tar, and it began to creep up the wall towards the ceiling, stretching and spreading, totally silent. Eric stared up at the ceiling, where the dark shape was now hovering, making the wallpaper look dimmer beneath it. The shadow wasn't looking for him. It didn't see him, because he was the one making noise. His own breathing, his heartbeat, the slight tremble of his clothes, all these things were making too much sound in the vacuum. He was too loud to be heard in the silence. He backed away slowly, still gripping the poker. He went into the powder room, locked the door, and stood in the dark. He held his breath until his lungs burned. He stood perfectly still, trying to match the silence of the house. After a few agonizing minutes, the dryness in his ears lifted. He heard it, a faint, low, constant hum. It was the low buzz of the streetlights outside. The sound barrier had dropped. And when it did, Eric heard other sounds, the scratching of something thin and sharp against the outside of the powder room door, followed by a heavy, wet thud as the door handle was tried violently. Whatever was in the house was now operating by touch and sound, but it couldn't tell the difference between ambient noise and a person. When the silence had returned, it couldn't see him. But when the house began to sound like the real world again, the hunt started. Eric spent the rest of the night standing in the powder room, holding his breath, listening for the awful moment the outside noises would vanish again. Every time the hum of the street lights faded, he knew the house was starting to swallow sound again, and the things that hid in the noise vacuum were close. He knew that when the house was truly silent, he was safe, but utterly invisible. And the moment the noise came back, he had to be ready to fight something that saw him only as a noise source. He made it to dawn. When the first ray of sunlight hit the powder room window, the cold in the air vanished. The street sounds were loud and clear, and the thump at the door had stopped. He unlocked the door. The hallway was empty. The dusty handprint on the bedroom wall was gone too. Eric never told his family why he had all the floorboards replaced that week. He never told them why he bought 3 noisy, ticking grandfather clocks and placed them on every floor. He needed noise, constant, confusing, real-world noise. Because Eric knew now that when he was truly home alone, the house was never empty, and the things living there were only harmless when they couldn't hear the silence of their own existence. Eric learned the hardest lesson of being alone. Silence can be a trap. The things that hide in the supernatural void don't hunt you. They hunt the noise you make when you try to hide. The house didn't just swallow sound that night. It spat out something that could finally see. Tell us where you're listening from in the comments. If you felt that familiar chill run down your spine, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the Black Hour Stories for more tales from the dead of night. This is the true account of a young woman who thought her biggest problem was missing her roommates, until she realized the presence next door wasn't human, and it needed her to think it was just as lonely as she was. Welcome to the Black Hour Stories. We promised you tales of supernatural loneliness, and this story proves that sometimes the only thing scarier than being alone is thinking something else is too. Sarah lived in a small, shared apartment. Her 2 roommates, Mia and Chloe, were gone for the Thanksgiving break. Sarah was home alone for the first time in 5 years. She found out quickly that the apartment building had a tenant they never saw, a presence that used the silence to perfect its disguise. Get comfortable, but keep the lights on. Story: Sarah missed the noise of her roommates. She missed Chloe singing off-key in the shower and Mia loudly heating up popcorn every evening. Now, the apartment was vast and echoey. On the second night of her solo stay, a Friday, she was sitting in the living room trying to read. It started with a faint scratching sound. It came from the wall shared by her apartment and the empty unit next door, Unit 4B. The scratching sounded exactly like a fingernail gently tapping wood, repeated quickly. Tap dash tap dash tap dash tap. She tried to ignore it. The building was old. Maybe it was settling. Maybe it was a mouse. But the sound was too rhythmic, too deliberate to be an animal. It paused, and then it started again, this time a little louder, a little closer to the center of the wall. Sarah got up and pressed her ear against the drywall. The tapping stopped immediately. Dead silence. She waited for a minute, then 2. Nothing. She stepped away, walked into the kitchen, and the tapping started again. Soft and hesitant, right where she had been standing. She felt a strange mix of annoyance and unease. Was someone playing a prank? Unit 4B was supposed to be empty. The landlord had told them it was being prepped for new tenants, but nobody had moved anything in or out for months. She decided to test it. She walked back to the wall, loud enough for her footsteps to carry. When she got within 2 feet, the tapping ceased. She waited 5 seconds, then quickly knocked on the wall twice with her knuckles. Knock, knock. She heard an immediate, identical reply from the other side. Knock, knock. Sarah's blood ran cold. That wasn't a prank. That was a response. It was too fast, too perfect. She knew it wasn't a human playing a game. A person would have hesitated, or laughed, or done something to break the tension. This response was immediate, like a reflex. She slowly backed away, eyes fixed on the wall. She felt a deep, chilling dread. Whatever was in 4B was listening to her, mimicking her, trying to prove that it was also just alone in an empty space. For the next few hours, she tried to focus on her book, but every few minutes, she'd hear a new sound. A light sigh, very quiet, like someone letting out a long breath they didn't know they were holding. Then, the sound of movement. It wasn't loud, heavy walking. It was a slow, shuffling drag, like dragging a large, heavy cloth across a hardwood floor. The sound moved slowly from one end of Unit 4B to the other. Sarah looked at the clock. It was 2 in the morning. She finally gave in to the fear and walked down the hall to the apartment's front door. She peered out the peephole. The hallway was dimly lit and empty. She turned back around, feeling foolish. That was when she smelled it. A powerful, ancient smell of wet earth and something sickly sweet, like decaying flowers. The smell was concentrated near the wall of 4B. She went to her kitchen drawer and pulled out a flashlight. She shone the beam on the wall. The paint was peeling slightly near the baseboard, and the wood trim looked damp. As she watched, a thin, brownish liquid began to seep slowly out of the crack between the trim and the carpet. It wasn't water. It was thick and dark. Suddenly, a sound erupted from the wall. It wasn't scratching or tapping this time. It was a muffled but distinct cough. It was a wet, rattling cough, like someone struggling to clear their lungs of something heavy. It lasted a few seconds, ending with a soft, desperate whimper. Sarah realized this was the entity trying to sound sick, trying to sound vulnerable, trying to make her feel sorry for the thing next door. It wanted her to believe it was just another lonely person, maybe someone elderly or hurt, alone in the empty apartment. She fled into her bedroom and locked the door. She piled pillows against the door to feel slightly safer, though she knew they wouldn't stop anything truly supernatural. She sat bolt upright, listening. The shuffling started again, slower now, weaker. It moved from the common wall towards the front door of 4B, which was across the hall from her own front door. Drag, 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 then silence. Sarah heard the distinct sound of a key being inserted into the lock of Unit 4B. The tumblers clicked. The lock turned, and she heard the squeak of the neighboring door opening just slightly. A breath held for too long escaped Sarah's lips. She shouldn't move. She shouldn't make a sound. But she couldn't help but look through her peephole again, just one quick look to confirm the door of 4B was actually open. She pressed her eye to the hole. The hallway was still dim. And there it was. The door to Unit 4B was open about an inch. Just enough to show a dark, absolute void inside the apartment, a darkness that seemed thicker than the regular hallway shadow. Then, from that inch-wide opening, something moved. It was a long, pale finger, incredibly thin, stretching out and tapping the wall right next to her own peephole. Tap, 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 tap. The sound was inches from her face, clear and sharp. The entity had gone to the hallway to knock on the outside of her door, just like she had knocked on the inside of the wall. It was imitating the action, forcing the interaction. and in the low light, the finger looked like dry bone, unnaturally long. It paused. The tapping stopped. A low, dry whisper came from the inch-wide gap of the neighbor's door, aimed straight at her peephole. It was a single, three-syllable word, sounding exactly like a plea. "Hello?" Sarah knew then that she was not home alone. She was the audience for a performance. Whatever was in 4B was using the lack of human noise to mimic the sounds of loneliness, trying to lure her out, trying to make her open her door. She spent the rest of the night curled up, holding her breath, listening to the shuffling sounds and fake coughs and taps, which now sounded frantic and desperate. It knew she was awake. It knew she was listening. It was trying to pretend it was just a neighbor who needed help, but the stench of wet decay and the unnatural movement of the shadows proved it was anything but. When her roommates finally came back Sunday night, Sarah acted normal. But she didn't tell them that the entire hallway outside 4B was now completely covered in the thin dark brown liquid, or that the door, which had been open an inch, was now tightly shut, the lock looking brand new, untouched. She had learned a terrible lesson. When you are home alone, sometimes the greatest danger comes from the thing next door that is trying to prove it is alone too. The true terror of the home alone experience isn't just the isolation. It's the realization that some entities are just lonely enough to learn how to imitate a friend. Sarah only survived because she refused to believe the sounds of distress coming from the empty room next door. Tell us where you're listening from in the comments. If this story made you look at your neighbor's door just a little closer, hit that like button and subscribe for more chills from the Black Hour stories. When a man inherits a strange, iron box, he discovers that being home alone means being the keeper of a terrible, ancient ritual that demands constant, silent company. Welcome to the Black Hour stories. Tonight we finish with a lesson in cursed objects. Mark thought inheriting his uncle's old house was a lucky break. It was a beautiful place, deep in the woods, far from neighbors. But with the house came a peculiar, heavy iron box, and Mark quickly found out that some objects don't just sit in a corner, they watch. This is the story of the lockbox ritual and the price of being its only observer. Mark's uncle, Silas, was a strange man, obsessed with relics and strange customs. When Silas died, Mark got the house. The will was clear. Mark had to live in the house for at least a year before he could sell it. Mark moved in, thrilled by the solitude. The house was cluttered with ancient junk, but one item stood out, a small, heavy iron box about the size of a loaf of bread sitting on the mantelpiece. It was black iron, forged crudely, with no hinges or seams. It was sealed shut, like one solid piece of metal. It had a single, thick, tarnished brass padlock attached to a loop on the lid, but there was no keyhole. The padlock was also solid, like it was melted onto the box. The uncle's lawyer called it the lockbox. He said Silas had kept it with him always, and Mark was instructed never to move it from the mantel or try to open it. Mark was home alone for the first week, trying to clean up. He kept finding himself drawn to the box. It didn't look special, but it felt intensely cold, even in the warm living room. When he put his hand near it, the air felt thick, heavy, and very still. On the third night, he was watching TV when he felt a shift in the air. The house suddenly felt like someone had walked into the room behind him. He spun around. Nothing, just the dark hallway. But when he looked back at the mantelpiece, he saw something unsettling. The lockbox had changed position. When he left it, the solid brass lock faced the left side of the room. Now it was turned slightly, facing directly at the couch where he was sitting. It had moved maybe an inch, but enough for the difference to be obvious. He got up and walked to the mantel. He put his hands on the box. It was cold, unnaturally cold. He pushed it back into its original position. It was too heavy for a mouse or the wind to have moved it. He sat back down, trying to convince himself he was tired and imagining things. He stared at the box. After maybe 20 minutes, he saw it move again. Not quickly, but slowly, like a watch hand ticking forward, until the brass lock was once again pointed right at him. It was watching him. The next day, Mark decided to try and break the padlock. He got a hammer and chisel. He lined the chisel up against the crude brass, ready to swing. As he raised the hammer, a sharp, terrible sound came from inside the house. It wasn't a sound of something breaking or falling. It was a quick, dry snap, like a bone breaking, immediately followed by a low, desperate hiss that seemed to come from the hallway floorboards. Mark froze. He lowered the hammer. The sound stopped. The silence came back, thick and judgmental. He looked at the lockbox. The brass lock was shining, almost reflecting the overhead light, looking brighter than it had a moment ago. He put the tools away. He knew that the sound was a warning and the box was protecting itself. He learned the rule quickly. The lockbox must be watched. When Mark turned his back, things went wrong. If he slept, he'd wake up to the smell of dust and sulfur and the sound of tiny, quick scratches behind the walls, getting closer to his bed. If he left the room to go to the kitchen, he'd come back to find every chair slightly moved, pointed toward the lockbox. But when he sat in the living room and stared at the box, the house was peaceful. The air was calm, and the strange, sickly sweet smell vanished. The box demanded his attention. It needed to be observed. It needed company. He started keeping rituals to satisfy it. He would sit for hours, just staring at the heavy brass lock. He learned that if he looked away for too long, the lock would start to change color, turning a dull, sickly green before quickly reverting when he looked back. He knew the green was the box getting angry. One night, exhausted, Mark decided to try and sneak away. He put a large, ornate mirror directly in front of the mantelpiece, positioning it so the lockbox was fully reflected. He thought if it could see itself, that would count. He went to the bedroom and lay down, closing his eyes. For the first time in days, he felt a measure of peace. It lasted about 5 minutes. Then he heard a sound from the living room. It was the sound of a very heavy object slowly scraping across the wooden mantel. SCHHH-SCHH ... Then a loud, awful crash as the heavy, ornate mirror shattered into 1,000 pieces. Mark ran back into the living room. Shards of glass were everywhere. The lockbox was now sitting right in the center of the mantel, the brass lock facing the smashed mirror. And the lock was intensely, violently green. Then he heard the whispering. It wasn't coming from the box itself. It was coming from the broken glass. He bent down, and from the fractured pieces, he heard dry, airy voices, too fast to understand, all combining into a chorus of frantic, angry noise. It sounded like the whispers he heard were talking about him. He quickly sat on the couch, fixing his gaze on the bright green lock. Slowly, very slowly, the green faded back to the tarnished brass. The whispers in the glass died out, and the broken mirror was silent. The house settled down. Mark stayed on the couch, staring at the box, for the entire night. He realized the thing inside the box, or the thing connected to the box, hated being reflected. It didn't want to see itself. It wanted to be seen by a living human. The lockbox wasn't keeping something in. It was the focal point of a ritual that demanded constant human witness. He was the one who was truly locked in. He never tried to leave the room again while the sun was down. He sat, staring at the box, becoming weaker and thinner every day. He knew he was fulfilling his uncle's terrible requirement. When his year was almost up, his wife came to check on him. She found him sitting in the living room, completely wasted away, staring blankly at the mantelpiece. He wasn't dead, but he was barely alive. The house was spotless. The lockbox was centered on the mantel, and the brass padlock was shiny and perfectly still. His wife rushed him to the hospital, and he never went back. But the doctors couldn't find anything wrong with him, just extreme exhaustion. When the new owners moved into the house, they took one look at the strange iron box on the mantel and immediately threw it in the trash. The next day, the new owner found the box back on the mantelpiece, sitting exactly in the center, and the shiny brass lock was turned toward the couch. The ritual had a new observer now. Mark escaped the house, but the lockbox remains. That small, crude piece of iron demands company, and it will always find someone home alone to watch it. Remember, sometimes the things that truly curse a home are the things that hate being unobserved. Tell us where you're listening from in the comments. If you're checking your own mantelpiece right now, be sure to like this video and subscribe to the Black Hour Stories for more tales of haunted objects and terrifying nights. When you are miles away from the nearest town, you expect to hear animals in the brush. But when the animal stands up on two legs and calls your name, you realize you made a terrible mistake coming out here alone. Welcome to the Black Hour Stories. You clicked on this because you wanted to hear about the deep woods, the places where no one can hear you scream. We have 3 stories tonight about isolation and the things that live in it. This first story is about a man looking for peace and quiet, but finding something much worse waiting for him in the trees. Jack needed a break from the city. The noise, the traffic, and the constant emails were wearing him down. He rented a small A-frame cabin in northern Idaho. The listing boasted about total seclusion. It was 5 miles down a dirt road that didn't even have a name on Google Maps. There was no Wi-Fi and no cell service. That was exactly what Jack wanted. He packed a cooler full of steaks and beer, threw his duffel bag in the trunk, and drove north. He arrived just as the sun was starting to dip behind the pine trees. The cabin was perfect. It was small wooden and smelled like cedar and old dust. A large deck wrapped around the front, overlooking a dense wall of forest. Jack unpacked his car and took a deep breath of the cold mountain air. It felt fresh, but there was a faint underlying smell of something musky. He assumed it was just damp wood or maybe a dead raccoon nearby. The first night was peaceful. He made a fire in the wood stove, cooked a steak, and read a book. The silence was heavy. In the city, silence is never real. There is always the hum of a fridge or a distant siren. Here, the silence felt like a weight pressing against his ears. Around 2 in the morning, Jack woke up. He didn't know what woke him. The fire had died down to glowing embers. The cabin was cold. He lay still in the loft bed, listening. Then he heard it. It sounded like footsteps on the gravel driveway. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Jack sat up. He knew bears were common in the area. He had brought a can of bear spray just in case, leaving it on the kitchen counter downstairs. He crept to the small window in the loft that looked out over the driveway. The moon was full, casting a pale blue light over the clearing. He saw a shape near his car. It looked like a deer. It was large, maybe a buck, but he couldn't see any antlers. It was just standing there, perfectly still, facing the cabin. Jack relaxed. It was just a deer. He watched it for a minute, waiting for it to move. It didn't graze. It didn't twitch its ears. It just stared at the cabin. Then the deer did something impossible. It reared up on its hind legs. Jack expected it to hop or reach for a high branch. Instead, it straightened its back. It stood fully upright, balancing perfectly like a man. Its front legs hung down loosely at its sides. The joints looked wrong, like they were bent in too many places. Jack stopped breathing. The thing took a step forward on two legs. It wasn't a hop, it was a stride. It walked toward the porch with a jerky, unnatural motion. Jack scrambled backward from the window, his heart hammering against his ribs. He heard the heavy thud of weight landing on the wooden deck stairs. One step, two steps. The wood creaked under something much heavier than a man. He stayed in the loft, terrified to make a sound. He heard the creature walking around the wraparound deck. It moved slowly. Every few seconds, there was a sound like wet leather rubbing against the wood. It circled the entire cabin. Then it stopped right in front of the main door. The doorknob rattled. Jack had locked it, but the lock was just a simple turn button on the handle. It wasn't a deadbolt. The knob turned left, then right. The door shook in the frame. The thing on the other side let out a sound. It wasn't a growl. It was a low, vibrating hum that seemed to come from deep in its chest. Then a voice came through the door. It was flat and monotone, like a recording played at the wrong speed. "Let me in." It wasn't a human voice. It sounded like someone trying to speak with a mouth full of water. Jack grabbed a heavy flashlight from his bedside table, his hand shaking so bad he almost dropped it. He didn't answer. He knew the old rules of the woods. You never invite them in. You never acknowledge them. "Jack, let me in." The creature knew his name. A cold sweat broke out on Jack's forehead. He hadn't spoken to anyone since he stopped for gas 4 hours ago. He hadn't told anyone his name. The pounding started. It wasn't a fist. It sounded like a hard, bony hoof slamming against the wood. The door bowed inward with each hit. Dust fell from the ceiling. Jack realized he was trapped. The only way out was the front door or the sliding glass door on the side, and the creature was right there. He crawled to the edge of the loft and looked down at the living room. The moonlight was streaming through the windows. He could see the shadow of the thing through the frosted glass of the front door. It was tall. The head was almost touching the top of the door frame. Suddenly, the pounding stopped. The silence rushed back in, louder than before. Jack waited. 5 minutes passed. 10. He thought maybe it had given up. Maybe it was gone. Then he heard a tap on the glass. He turned his head toward the sliding glass door on the side of the cabin. The curtains were drawn, but they were thin. A dark shape was pressed against the glass. A long, dark finger with an extra joint was tapping on the pane. Tap. Tap. Jack. Outside. The voice was coming from the glass now. It sounded different this time. It sounded like his brother. It was a perfect imitation of his brother's voice, but without any emotion behind it. His brother lived in Florida. His brother was not in the woods of Idaho. Jack squeezed his eyes shut. He gripped the flashlight like a club. He told himself it wasn't real. He told himself he was having a nightmare. But the smell of musk and rot was seeping through the cracks in the cabin walls. It smelled like old meat left in the sun. The tapping got harder. The glass began to vibrate. If that glass broke, there was nothing between him and that thing. Jack finally yelled out, "Go away! I have a gun." He didn't have a gun. He hoped the bluff would work. The tapping stopped immediately. For a second, Jack thought it worked. Then, a sound erupted from outside that chilled his blood. It was laughter. But it wasn't human laughter. It was the sound of a coyote yipping and howling, twisted into the rhythm of a human laugh. It was mocking him. The creature didn't try to break the glass. It just stood there, breathing heavy, wet breaths that fogged up the window. Jack sat in the corner of the loft, staring at the stairs, waiting for the sound of breaking glass. He didn't sleep. He didn't move. He just watched the shadows shift as the moon moved across the sky. Hours passed. The breathing stopped. The shadow retreated from the window. When the sun finally crested over the mountains, filling the cabin with gray morning light, Jack was stiff and freezing. He waited until the sun was fully up before he moved. He crept downstairs, bear spray in one hand, flashlight in the other. The cabin was empty. The front door was still locked. He walked to the sliding glass door and pulled back the curtain. The glass was smeared with a greasy yellow substance. He unlocked the door and stepped out onto the deck. The air was cold and still. The birds were singing as if nothing had happened. Jack walked around to the front door. The wood was scarred. There were deep gouges in the solid oak, like something had tried to carve its way through with knives. But the worst part wasn't the door. It was the dirt around the porch. In the soft mud, there were prints. They looked like deer tracks, but they were wrong. They were too deep, and they were spaced out like a man walking. And right next to the hoof prints, there were handprints. Long, thin handprints with 6 fingers. Jack didn't even pack his bag. He grabbed his keys and his wallet. He got in his car and drove. He didn't look in the rearview mirror until he hit the paved road 5 miles away. He never went back to the cabin. He paid a moving company to go get his things a week later. They told him everything was fine, but they asked him one question. They asked if he had a dog. He said no. They told him it was strange because the inside of the cabin smelled like a wet, dirty animal, and all the mirrors in the bathroom had been smashed. Jack was lucky he didn't open that door. Whatever was out there wasn't a deer, and it definitely wasn't his brother. It makes you wonder what really watches us when we think we are alone in nature. Tell us in the comments where you are listening from tonight. Are you in the city or out in the woods? If you enjoyed this story, please hit the like button and subscribe for the next 2 stories in this series. There is a specific kind of fear that comes from being 40 feet in the air in a glass box. You can see everything coming from miles, but when something finally climbs those stairs to get you, there is nowhere left to run. You are listening to the Black Hour Stories. We are continuing our journey into the deep woods. Our first story showed us that cabins aren't safe. Now we go higher. This second story is about a fire lookout in Oregon. These towers are designed to keep people safe, to spot danger from far away. But sometimes the danger isn't a fire. It's something that walks out of the smoke. Sarah took the job as a fire lookout because she wanted the view. She was stationed at Desolation Peak in a 60-foot tower overlooking a massive valley of fir trees. It was a lonely job. She spent weeks at a time without seeing another human face. Her only contact was a crackly radio connection to the base station 20 miles away. For the first month, it was routine. She woke up, scanned the horizon for smoke, radioed in her report, and read paperback novels. The isolation was peaceful. The wind howled through the metal grating of the catwalk, and the storms were magnificent. But in late October, the atmosphere changed. The woods went quiet. Usually, Sarah could hear birds, the rustle of wind in the trees, or the distant call of elk. But on a Tuesday afternoon, the silence fell like a heavy blanket. The air grew still. The sky turned a bruised purple color, even though there were no storm clouds. Sarah grabbed her binoculars and did a sweep of the tree line. That's when she saw it. About a mile away, in a clearing of tall grass, there was a figure. It was bright yellow, standing out sharply against the dark green of the forest. It looked like someone wearing a heavy rain slicker, the kind fishermen wear. But it wasn't raining. It hadn't rained in weeks. Sarah adjusted the focus. The person was standing perfectly still. They weren't hiking. They weren't setting up camp. They were just standing there, facing the tower. Sarah waved. She knew they probably couldn't see her from that distance without binoculars of their own, but it was instinct. The figure didn't move. She went back to her book, checking every 10 minutes. An hour passed, 2 hours. The yellow figure hadn't moved an inch. They hadn't sat down or shifted their weight. They stood like a statue in the middle of the wilderness. A cold feeling started in Sarah's stomach. It wasn't natural for a human to stand that still for that long. She grabbed the radio handset. "Base, this is Tower 4. I have a visual on a hiker in Sector 3. Stationary for 2 hours. Possible medical issue. Over. Static." She tried again. "Base, do you copy?" Nothing but white noise. She checked the batteries. They were full. She checked the antenna connection. It was fine. The radio was dead, cut off by something other than bad reception. The sun began to set. The valley plunged into shadow. Sarah looked through the binoculars one last time before the light failed. The yellow figure was gone. She let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. It must have been a trick of the light, or maybe just a weird hiker who finally moved on. She locked the heavy trapdoor that led down the stairs, a strict rule for lookouts at night, and made tea. Darkness took over. The glass box turned into a mirror, reflecting the inside of the cabin. Sarah tried to read, but she felt exposed. She turned off her lantern so she could see out into the night. The moon was a thin sliver, offering barely any light. Then she heard the sound, clang. It was the sound of a boot hitting the bottom metal step of the tower. Sarah froze. The tower was 60 feet high. The stairs zigzagged up in open air. There was no reason for anyone to be climbing them in the pitch black. Clang, clang. The steps were slow and heavy. Whoever it was, they weren't trying to be quiet. They were taking their time. Sarah grabbed her flashlight and a flare gun she kept in the emergency kit. She didn't have a weapon, but a flare to the chest would stop most things. Clang! They were halfway up. Sarah went to the window and shined her flashlight down through the grate. The beam cut through the darkness and hit the stairs. There was the yellow raincoat. It was climbing, but as the light hit it, Sarah screamed. The raincoat was empty. It was inflated, as if a body was inside it, but there were no hands coming out of the sleeves. There were no boots in the pant legs. The coat and pants were moving on their own, bending and stepping as if an invisible man was wearing them, and where the head should be, there was nothing. Just the popped collar of the yellow slicker surrounding empty air. The thing stopped when the light hit it. The empty sleeves rose up, grabbing the handrail. It pulled itself up another step. Sarah scrambled back from the window. She checked the trapdoor lock 3 times. It was a solid steel bolt. She piled her heavy trunk of books on top of it, just to be sure. The footsteps reached the top landing. She could hear the heavy, wet fabric of the raincoat brushing against the door. Then a knock. It wasn't a knuckle. It sounded like wet meat slapping against the wood. Slap, slap. Open, a voice said. It wasn't a voice from outside. It was coming from her radio. The dead radio on the desk crackled to life, speaking the word clearly. Open. Sarah stared at the radio in horror. Go away. She screamed at the door. Open. Cold. Open. The radio voice was changing. It started deep, but then shifted pitch, becoming higher. It sounded like Sarah's own voice. Open. I'm cold. Sarah, open the door. It was recording her. It was using her words. The thing outside slammed against the trapdoor. The heavy wooden hatch jumped an inch, lifting the trunk of books. Sarah threw her weight onto the trunk. She could feel the power of the thing beneath her. It wasn't wind. It was a solid, massive force pushing up. The yellow raincoat was squeezing through the cracks. She saw slivers of yellow urethane pushing through the seams of the door frame, bubbling like melting plastic. It smelled like burning rubber and ozone. Sarah fired the flare gun through the glass of the window, hoping to signal someone, anyone. The red light exploded into the night, illuminating the catwalk. For a split second, she saw that the raincoat wasn't empty anymore. Filled inside the hood, staring through the glass, was a face made of smoke. It had no eyes, just a gaping, swirling mouth. The radio screamed. It was a high-pitched screech of feedback that shattered the glass of the lantern. Sarah covered her ears and curled into a ball on top of the trunk, sobbing, praying for the sun to come up. The pounding continued for hours. The radio kept whispering her name in her own voice. When the first gray light of dawn touched the horizon, the pounding stopped instantly. The radio went silent. Sarah didn't move for another 2 hours. When the sun was fully up, shining bright and warm on the glass, she finally stood up. She moved the trunk and unlocked the trap door. She pushed it open, ready to swing the flashlight. The stairs were empty. But on the metal landing, right outside the door, lay the yellow raincoat. It was shredded, torn into ribbons as if a pack of wolves had torn it apart. And underneath it, melted into the metal grating, were scorch marks in the shape of bare human footprints. Sarah radioed for a helicopter extraction 10 minutes later. The radio worked perfectly. When the rescue crew arrived, they asked about the raincoat. Sarah told them she didn't know whose it was. One of the pilots picked it up with a stick He turned pale. He showed Sarah the inside of the collar. Written in black permanent marker was a name, Daniel. Daniel was the name of the lookout who had staffed Tower 4 in the 1980s. He had vanished during a storm and was never found. Sarah never went back to fire watch. She lives in the city now, on the ground floor. She says the worst part wasn't the ghost or the creature. It was the fact that the radio worked just fine when the thing wanted to speak. It means it wasn't broken. It was just waiting for the right time to say hello. Tell us in the comments, could you spend a night alone in a fire tower, knowing you're the only light for 20 miles? If you're enjoying these stories, make sure to like the video so we can find you in the dark. When you spend your life on the road, you get used to wildlife crossings. But when a creature that looks like a dog runs in front of your truck and then stands up to look you in the eye, you know you're facing something that belongs nowhere near the highway. Welcome back to the Black Hour Stories. This is our third and final story tonight, wrapping up our theme of isolation and the darkness that lives in remote places. We have been in a cabin and a fire tower. Now we are on the open road. This story follows a truck driver named Dave, a man who thought he had seen everything until he drove Route 50 in the dead of night. Dave had been driving trucks for 25 years. He drove all the lower 48 states and knew the roads like the lines on his own palm. He was a professional driver, rarely sped, and always checked his rig. He hated driving through the emptiness of Nevada, but that's where the route took him. He was on US Route 50, a stretch they called the loneliest road in America, and he was driving at 3 a.m. There were no lights, no towns, and no cell service for dozens of miles at a time. The only sound was the deep rumble of his engine and the rush of the air past the cab. He was running on coffee and muscle memory. The moon was high and bright, making the scrub brush and the jagged mountains look bleached white and spooky. He was deep in the desert when it happened. He saw a flash of brown fur run out from the darkness on the passenger side and dart right across the highway. It was large, maybe a German shepherd or a husky, but it was moving fast. Dave instinctively slammed on the air brakes. The 18-wheeler screamed, shaking the whole cab, and the truck skidded. Dave swore, gripping the steering wheel. He was sure he had hit the dog. He pulled the truck over to the side of the road, the whole rig rocking to a stop. He grabbed his heavy flashlight and got out. The sudden silence was shocking after the engine roar. The desert air was intensely cold, and it carried a sharp mineral smell like rust and dry dirt. Dave walked back to where he thought he had hit the animal. He searched the pavement and the shoulder. He looked for blood or fur or any sign of a dog. There was nothing, not a scrape, not a sound. It was as if the animal had simply vanished. Dave figured he must have stopped just in time. The adrenaline made his head fuzzy. He turned to head back to the truck. That's when he saw it again. It was standing about 20 feet away, near the wire fence that separated the highway from the desert. It was the same dog. It was massive, dark brown, and looked like a starving wolf. It was perfectly still, staring at him. Dave raised his flashlight and shined the beam directly onto the animal. The light didn't bother it. The dog didn't squint or turn its head away. It just stood there, staring. Its eyes reflected the light back bright yellow, like car headlights. And then, slowly, the dog stood up. It rose onto its hind legs, straightening its spine and stretching its body until it was taller than Dave. It was easily 6.5 feet tall. The transformation was unsettling. Its legs didn't seem to bend the way a dog should. They stretched and clicked into place. Its front paws, still covered in dark fur, hung down like human hands, long and spindly. The creature didn't move any closer. It just stood there in the moonlight, its head cocked slightly to the side, looking at him with intelligent, patient interest. Dave dropped the flashlight. He didn't wait to see what would happen next. He turned and sprinted back to the cab, scrambling to get inside and lock the door. He threw the truck into gear and slammed the gas pedal to the floor. The engine roared and the truck started to move, slow at first, then picking up speed. Dave was shaking so violently he could barely hold the wheel straight. He looked into the passenger side mirror. The creature was gone. Dave felt a wave of relief wash over him. It must have retreated into the dark. He sped up, pushing the massive truck far past the speed limit, needing to get to the next town, no matter how small. He drove for maybe a minute, staring straight ahead at the lonely road. Then a movement flashed in his peripheral vision. A dark shape was running alongside the passenger door. Dave didn't want to look, but he couldn't help himself. He turned his head slowly. The creature was keeping pace with the truck, running on its 2 back legs. The movement was a blur of dark fur and unnatural speed. Its long, clawed front hands were swinging wildly. The dog's face was pressed against the glass of the passenger window. It wasn't a dog face anymore. The fur around the muzzle was receding, pulled back like rubber. The snout had flattened into a horrifying, stretched parody of a human face. It had too many teeth, and they were all sharp. Its yellow eyes were wide and focused only on Dave. The creature smiled. The smile was wide and empty, reaching back to its ears. It looked like something wearing a mask of human agony. Dave yelled, a sound that was lost to the engine noise. He veered the truck wildly, trying to swerve into the creature, but the thing was too fast. It kept up with the truck easily, gliding over the desert floor. Then Dave heard a sound over the engine noise. Screech. It was the sound of metal being dragged across glass. The creature was using one of its long clawed hands to rake the passenger window. Dave pushed the truck faster, praying for the dawn. He felt something cold penetrate the cab. The smell of rust and the wet dog musk filled the air. He drove like that for 30 straight miles. The creature kept pace. Its smile never changed. It just ran beside him, scratching at the glass and staring. Finally, just as the sky began to turn a weak, watery gray in the east, the creature suddenly dropped back. It disappeared instantly into the shadows of the rising sun. Dave didn't slow down until he reached the first gas station in the next state. He pulled into the parking lot, turned off the engine, and slumped over the steering wheel, shaking uncontrollably. He sat there for an hour, waiting for his hands to stop trembling. Finally, he got out of the cab to stretch. He walked around to the passenger side, expecting to find the window smashed. The window was intact. It was a thick tempered glass designed to withstand road debris. But running vertically down the glass, directly over where the creature's distorted face had been pressed, were 3 deep, parallel gouges. They weren't just surface scratches. They were etched deep into the glass, like someone had carved them with a diamond. No animal paw could have done that. Dave sold his rig a month later and took a job working in a warehouse. He never drove a lonely road at night again. The trucker still has the pictures of those marks on his phone. He knows it wasn't a dog, a coyote, or any animal on 4 legs. It was something that found the most isolated road it could and waited for the light to go out. If you made it this far, thank you for listening to the Black Hour Stories. Tell us where you're listening from in the comments below. And if these stories kept you looking over your shoulder, please smash that like button and subscribe for more nights just like this one. What happened in that dark, wet basement was not a prank. It was a cold, hard encounter with something that wanted us trapped forever. Welcome to the Black Hour Stories. We promised you a true account of a cursed place, and this is it, the story of 3 friends and a dare that went horribly wrong in the basement of the old Miller house. The moment we stepped over that threshold, the air changed. It didn't just feel cold. It felt heavy, like we were suddenly underwater and something dark was pressing down on us. Pay attention to the strange feeling that started in the back of Mike's neck, because that chill was the first sign that this place was alive and it wasn't friendly. They called it the Miller house, though no one named Miller had lived there for 60 years. It sat high on a hill, rotting slow and steady, overlooking the main road. Kids always dared each other to go inside. The real dare, the one that meant you were truly brave or truly stupid, was to spend an hour in the basement. That's what we decided to do, me, Mike, and Jenna. We were 18, feeling tough and bored on a hot August night. We drove up there with 1 flashlight, 1 cheap tape recorder, and a 6-pack of beer. We had heard all the stories. People whispering that a woman died down there, that the ground was poisoned, that anything you left in the basement overnight was changed forever. We pushed the kitchen door open. The smell hit us first, wet dirt, old wood rot, and something sharp, like old pennies and stale cleaning chemical all mixed up. We didn't linger. We went straight for the basement door. It was heavy wood, painted white a long time ago, now cracked and peeled. Mike pulled it open, and the squeak of the hinges sounded like a scream. The air coming up the stairs was ice cold, even though it was 90 degrees outside. The stairs were steep and muddy. We went down slow, the single beam of the flashlight dancing over the stone walls. The basement wasn't deep, maybe 12 feet below ground. The floor was rough, packed earth, uneven and damp. There was nothing much down there, just some broken jars and an ancient, rusty wash basin. The ceiling was low, with thick, rough beams. The tape recorder was Jenna's idea. She put it on the ledge of the coal chute, pressed record, and we sat on the damp floor drinking the beer. We waited for something to happen. 10 minutes went by. Nothing. We started laughing, saying the stories were fake, that we were just sitting in a dirty cellar. That's when we heard the sound. It wasn't a thump or a crash. It was a drag, like a heavy, waterlogged blanket being slowly pulled across the dirt floor, right over in the corner we couldn't see well. The sound was wet and grinding. It stopped when we pointed the light at the corner. We all felt it then, the shift. The cold wasn't just cold anymore. It was stinging, an aggressive kind of temperature that sank deep into your bones. Mike put his hand to his neck and said his hair was standing up. "It's just the draft," I tried to say, but my voice was weak. We were no longer joking. We stood up to leave. Mike went first, climbing the bottom steps. He was about halfway up when he stopped dead. He wasn't breathing. Jenna whispered, "What is it?" Mike turned his head slowly, and his eyes were wide and terrified. "The door," he choked out. "It's closed." It wasn't just closed. It was shut tight, and we hadn't heard it move. We all remembered the loud squeak when he opened it. Now it was silent and sealed. Mike pushed on it. He shoved his whole shoulder against the wood. The door did not budge. It was like the handle had vanished and the door frame had fused itself together. The thing was locked. That grinding sound started again, closer this time and faster. The heavy, wet drag was now moving in the darkness behind us. The flashlight beam was shaking too hard in Jenna's hand to keep steady. We all screamed when the jars moved. The old broken jars on the wash basin, maybe 6 feet away, lifted an inch off the shelf and crashed down, shattering on the stone floor. But there was no wind, no earthquake, no one touching them. They just fell. And from the dark space near the wash basin came a new, terrible sound. It was the sound of something sucking air in, a slow, deep, ragged inhale. We ran back to the locked door, beating on it with our fists, screaming for help even though we knew no one was nearby. The thing that made the noise was in the room with us, and it was moving out of the shadows. A smell like rotten meat and ozone hit us, choking us. We could see a disturbance in the dust near the wash basin. The dust on the ground was kicking up, swirling in a small funnel, but there was no breeze, and the air was dead still. The shape of the swirling dust was long and low, like something crawling. It was coming for us. Jenna started crying and pointed at the wall. High up on the stone, where the wall met the ceiling, a mark began to appear. It was a smear of thick, dark residue, like old dried blood, and it looked like a handprint. As we watched, horrified, another one appeared next to it. They were too large to be human hands, and they looked heavy, dripping something black and viscous onto the wall. The scratching started then. It wasn't the sound of fingernails. It was thick, hard claws dragging across the rough rock wall, following the line of the ceiling right above our heads. Click, scratch, click, scratch, click, scratch. We huddled against the locked door, wishing we were dead, wishing we had never taken the dare. Mike was kicking the door as hard as he could, yelling till his throat was raw. And then he saw it. In the corner near the coal chute, where Jenna had put the tape recorder, a flicker appeared. It was a dull, sickly yellow light, and it was spinning. The light grew stronger, twisting and tightening into a small, hazy ball, maybe the size of a fist. It looked solid, heavy, and very wrong. Then the light launched itself across the basement. It didn't fly. It moved too fast and too steady for that. It shot straight for Mike's face. He didn't have time to dodge. The yellow light hit his forehead with a dull thud. Mike didn't fall down, but he became utterly still. His eyes went glassy, staring right through the wood door. The light was gone, but there was a red, raised welt on his skin where it had struck. He was breathing, but he wasn't Mike. He turned away from us, his face slack and empty, and he walked slowly toward the corner where the scratching thing was waiting. He was walking directly into the darkest part of the basement. Jenna grabbed his arm, pulling hard. "Mike, stop it. What are you doing?" He didn't answer. He didn't even look at her. He just kept pulling his arm away, his strength terrifyingly calm. Jenna and I both held on to him, fighting to keep him from walking into the blackness. He was stronger than both of us combined, and his face was cold and smooth. The worst part was his silence. He was possessed by a quiet focus on the dark corner. We wrestled him for what felt like an hour, our feet slipping in the damp earth. Then, without warning, the heavy grinding noise stopped. The scratching on the walls stopped. The smell faded, and the locked door upstairs burst open with a loud, heavy crash. 3 boys from the next town, doing the same stupid dare, stood at the top of the stairs, their eyes wide. They saw us struggling with Mike and rushed down to help. As soon as the sunlight from the hallway touched the stone walls, Mike collapsed. When we got him outside, the welt on his head was gone. He remembered nothing after we heard the first strange sound. But when Jenna played the tape back later, there was no beer drinking, no talking, just 3 minutes of dead silence, followed by a sound no human throat could make, a low, humming, buzzing frequency that cut off abruptly when the door crashed open. Whatever locked us in, whatever sent that light at Mike, it was real. And when we left, we all looked back up at the Miller house and saw a flicker of sickly yellow light, just for a second, in one of the dusty basement windows. Mike never went near the woods again. Jenna threw the tape recorder away. And the door? Those other boys swore they didn't touch the lock. They said they just pulled the knob and it swung right open. But we know the truth. Something let us out just when it thought it had taken one of us for good. Tell us where you're listening from in the comments. Like and subscribe to the Black Hour Stories for more of the real things that bite in the night. We tried to throw it away, burn it, and even bury it far from town. But the doll always found its way back to the rocking chair in our living room. Welcome back to the Black Hour Stories. Tonight, we're looking at an object curse, a beautiful antique that turned into a nightmare for one quiet family in rural Ohio. They thought they bought a piece of history, something lovely for the mantle. What they got was a vessel for something dark, something that absolutely refused to be separated from them. This story shows that sometimes the things that find you are the things that own you. Sarah and Ben bought the doll at an estate sale near Toledo. It was beautiful, truly. About 20 inches high, porcelain face, glass eyes that looked strangely real, and a dress of faded blue silk. The tag said it was from 1910. Sarah loved antiques, and she thought it would look perfect sitting in the old wooden rocking chair in the parlor. They paid $20 for it, a steal they thought. They brought it home that Saturday afternoon. The first strange thing happened quickly. When Ben put the doll in the rocking chair, it tilted slightly. He straightened it up, making sure it was centered. He walked away to the kitchen. When he came back 3 minutes later, the doll was tilted again, but this time its head was turned slightly toward the front door. Ben thought he hadn't placed it right. He ignored it and went back to unpacking boxes. That night, they heard something. A small rhythmic tap-tap-tap coming from the living room. It was faint, but clear in the silent house. Ben went to look. The doll was sitting still in the rocking chair, but the small wooden rocker was moving just slightly, enough to make the noise against the floorboards. Ben stopped the chair with his foot, checked the windows, and went back to bed. He told himself it was the house settling, or maybe the floor was just uneven. The next morning, the doll was facing a different direction. It was looking directly at their bedroom door. Sarah was the one who noticed it, and she was creeped out. She picked it up, intending to move it to a shelf, but the moment her fingers touched the cold porcelain, She felt a strong, electric jolt like static that ran up her arm. She dropped it on the couch immediately. "It's just old porcelain," Ben said. But that night, the rocking started again, louder this time and faster. It sounded like someone was actually sitting in the chair, swaying back and forth. Thump, thump, thump. Ben was annoyed. He went downstairs, picked up the doll, and carried it to the basement. He didn't want to throw it out yet because Sarah had loved its look. He put it on a high shelf next to the furnace, far from the rocking chair. They slept soundly for 2 nights. On the 3rd morning, Sarah went downstairs to make coffee. She stopped dead at the entrance to the living room. The doll was back. It was sitting in the same old rocking chair. It was centered, straight, and staring at the kitchen entrance. They had locked the basement door. They lived alone. There was no way it could have climbed down the shelf, walked up the stairs, unlocked the door, and placed itself in the chair. The skin on Ben's arms prickled. This was the first undeniable proof that something was wrong. They looked closely at the doll. Its silk dress was now faintly dusty, like it had been dragged across a cement floor. Ben took it outside that day. He put it in a black garbage bag and drove 3 miles to the county dump. He found a huge industrial dumpster behind a closed warehouse and threw the heavy bag deep inside, covering it with old boxes and trash. He drove home feeling relieved. The relief lasted until 8 p.m. that night. They were watching television when the doorbell rang. It was an old woman from 2 streets over, shaking and holding a familiar black bag. "Is this yours?" she asked, her voice thin. "I found it sitting right on my porch swing." It was perfectly placed, like someone set it there very gently. "I thought maybe your dog dragged it." Ben took the bag. He opened it. There was the doll, perfectly intact, though the delicate silk dress was torn slightly at the hem. He had thrown it in a dumpster 3 miles away, behind a locked gate. Fear turned to anger. Ben decided to destroy it. He took the doll to the backyard fire pit. He doused it in lighter fluid. He struck a match and tossed it. The flame caught the fluid and roared up. They watched the fire for 20 minutes. The flame was hot enough to melt metal, but the doll did not burn. The blue silk dress turned black and crispy, but the porcelain head and hands remained bright white. The glass eyes, though, they melted. They didn't crack or burst. They ran slow, like thick black syrup, down the doll's porcelain cheeks. And as the eyes melted, they heard a faint, high-pitched giggle from within the fire pit. When the fire died down, Ben used a stick to turn the remains. The body was charred wood, but the head and limbs were untouched. It was impossible. He took the multi-doll inside and placed it in an empty toolbox in the garage, locking the lid. He was going to take it to the river the next morning and drop it where the current was fastest. That night, Sarah woke up to a terrible smell. It was sickly sweet and heavy, like Lily left to rot. It was coming from the hallway. She sat up, terrified. The house was dead quiet, no rocking, no tapping, just the smell. She crept out of bed and looked into the hallway. The smell was stronger here, and then she saw it. On the wooden floor, leading from the garage door toward their bedroom, were small, muddy footprints. They were too small to be a child's, tiny and deep, like a small, hard weight was being placed down one step at a time. The track stopped right outside their door. Sarah didn't move. She waited, heart hammering, for 5 minutes. Then she heard a low, wet thump from the garage. She screamed for Ben. They ran to the garage and found the toolbox open on the floor. The doll was gone. But what replaced it was horrifying. Sitting on the workbench was a dead sparrow. Its neck was twisted, and its wings were folded neatly, unnaturally, on its back. The sparrow was placed perfectly next to the toolbox, and beside the sparrow, the porcelain head of the doll sat upright. The black melted eyes were now dry and solid, and they were staring straight at Sarah. This was no ordinary haunting. This thing was actively returning, and it was showing them that it could travel and that it could kill. Ben knew they couldn't keep it. He took the porcelain head and the limbs and drove far out of the county to an old, unused cemetery on a lonely back road. He dug a deep hole in the frozen ground and buried the pieces separately, scattering them so they could never be reassembled. He poured concrete mix into the hole and waited for it to harden. He went home feeling sick but safe. 2 weeks later, he got a call from the cemetery caretaker. A large, strange bird had been found dead on the caretaker's porch swing, a crow with its wings folded neatly, unnaturally on its back. And beneath the crow, half buried in the mud near the swing, was the doll's head. Not the whole thing, just the porcelain skull, clean, white, and staring at the caretaker's front door. The black eyes were still there, still dried into a look of eternal judgment. Ben and Sarah sold the house within a month and moved to a new state. They didn't dare touch the head again. They just left it on the porch swing for the caretaker to deal with. They hoped the entity was attached to the object, not the people. But they often wonder what the new owners of the house found sitting in that rocking chair when they first walked into the living room. Some things don't want to be owned. They want to be the owner. The doll found its way back to a familiar porch, a chilling sign that the object, even in pieces, knew exactly where to go. Tell us where you're listening from in the comments. Like and subscribe to the Black Hour Stories to keep the lights on through the night. The photos were charming, old-fashioned, and full of smiling faces. The problem was, every person pictured had died in the exact room where I found the album. Welcome to the Black Hour Stories. Moving into a historic home always comes with stories, but sometimes those stories aren't just in the walls. They're right there on your coffee table, staring back at you. This is the story of Alex, who bought an old Victorian house in Connecticut and found a secret history that was still actively watching him from the pages of an old book. Once you see the dead, it's hard to unsee them. Alex bought the 2-story Victorian on the edge of town because the price was right and the woodwork was incredible. It was over 100 years old and had been empty for a decade. The previous owner had died there, alone, and the family just sold it with all the junk inside. That was fine by Alex. He liked history. He spent the first week cleaning out the attic and the cellar. Everything was covered in a thick layer of dust and spiderwebs. In the parlor, he found a sturdy oak chest tucked behind a bookshelf. Inside, among some brittle lace and old letters, was a leather-bound photo album. It was heavy, with a deep red cover and brass clasps. He opened it on the third night. The photos were black and white, thick, with crimped edges, dating back to the 1920s and 30s. They were mostly pictures of one family, the Garrisons, smiling on the porch, celebrating birthdays, and sitting by the huge fireplace. It was nice, pleasant history. He brought the album to the living room and set it on the table, planning to look through it later. The first strange thing happened after he looked at the first page for too long. There was a photo of a young woman with a long braid standing right by the staircase. She was smiling brightly. Alex stared at her, thinking how much the house hadn't changed. When he looked up from the album, he saw a faint indentation, a quick shadow that moved at the corner of his eye near the actual staircase. It wasn't a shape, just a movement, like someone had been standing there a second ago. He turned the page. The next picture showed an old man dressed in a sharp suit sitting in the dining room, looking sternly at the camera. He was sitting at the massive mahogany table that was still in the house. Later that night, Alex was making dinner in the kitchen. He had a sudden, overwhelming urge to go check the dining room. He walked in, flipped on the light, and paused. The air was colder than the rest of the house. He swore he smelled pipe tobacco, even though he didn't smoke. And he saw a faint ring of moisture, like a glass had been set down, right where the old man in the photo had been sitting at the table. It vanished as soon as he reached out for it. The photos were anchoring something to the present. The next day, he looked closer at the photos. They were all taken inside or right next to the house. There were captions written in neat, sloping handwriting below each picture. He started reading them out loud as he went through the album. Page 8. Sarah, 1926. Our sweet girl, enjoying the garden before her illness. Page 14. The patriarch, John, 1930. The last summer in his favorite chair. Page 22. Little Billy and the puppy, 1937. Happy until the very end. The captions all ended darkly. Alex started getting a sick feeling. He went online and searched for the Garrison family history. What he found confirmed his fear. The Garrisons were a tragic family. The young woman, Sarah, had died of consumption in the second-floor bedroom. The patriarch, John, died of a sudden heart attack sitting in his favorite chair in the dining room. And little Billy drowned in the bathtub upstairs when the house was almost empty. Every happy face in the album was a record of a person who had met a sudden, terrible end right there in the house. This was not just history. It was a memorial, a terrible diary of death. Alex got to a picture of a couple, smiling, standing right in the doorway to the attic. The caption read, Eleanor and Thomas, 1941. So excited to start their life here. He closed the book and felt a chill. The first night he slept in the house, he had heard a strange, heavy scratching sound coming from the attic right above his head. He had convinced himself it was just squirrels. Now he knew better. He knew exactly what had happened to Eleanor and Thomas. The official record said a fire, a terrible accident, but Alex suspected something else, something trapped up there. He decided to get rid of the album. It felt like the focus point of the hauntings. He took the book outside and placed it in the center of the backyard. He planned to cover it in oil and burn it, just like he would any other piece of trash he wanted gone forever. He went back inside to get the gasoline can. When he came back out 60 seconds later, the album was gone from the center of the yard. He searched everywhere. The grass was wet with dew, but there were no footprints, no drag marks, nothing. The album had vanished into thin air. He went back inside, locking all the doors, feeling the panic rise in his throat. He checked the living room. The album was back on the coffee table. Not tossed there, but perfectly placed, centered on the wooden surface. Alex reached out to touch it and he stopped. The book was open. It was open to the very last page, which he hadn't seen before. This last picture was different. It wasn't black and white. It was faded color, probably from the 1960s. It showed a slightly younger version of the former owner, the one who died 10 years ago, an older man with glasses. He was sitting on the sofa, right where Alex was standing now, smiling faintly at the camera. But the caption beneath the picture was the worst part. It was written in a new, darker ink. It read, "Edward, 1999, resting comfortably in his favorite room, waiting for company." The ink was wet. Alex jumped back, slamming into the wall. He stared at the picture, and then he realized something truly horrifying. Edward, the dead former owner, was not alone in the photo. Reflected faintly in the glass of the picture frame, just behind Edward's shoulder, was a shape. It was a tall, indistinct black shadow, featureless and looming. It was not Edward's shadow. It looked like the shadow of a person standing directly behind the camera. Alex looked up quickly, scanning the room, but he was alone. He looked back at the reflective picture glass, and the black shape was still there, but it had moved slightly. It was positioned now as if it were standing directly behind Alex, looking over his shoulder at the photo album. He didn't scream, he didn't run. He just reached out, slid the picture from the page, grabbed his coat and keys, and walked out the door, leaving the house unlocked, leaving the album open on the table. The last thing he heard before the screen door slammed was a muffled, dry click from the living room, like an old camera shutter closing. He never went back for anything. He sold the house remotely, taking a huge loss. He still carries the last picture in his wallet. He's afraid to destroy it, afraid that if the photo is destroyed, whatever took the picture might decide to take him instead. It wasn't just an album of the dead. It was a gallery of its victims, and it was still taking submissions. The entities in the house were using the photos to keep their company close, and they seemed to have one final empty spot. Tell us where you're listening from in the comments. Like and subscribe to the Black Hour Stories. We'll be waiting. This is the story of a road trip that went south, where the darkness wasn't just outside the headlights, but waiting inside the car. Stay right here to hear about the trip they took down Route 16 and the thing they brought home. Welcome to the Black Hour Stories. Tonight, we're driving straight into the middle of nowhere on a highway called Route 16. A stretch of asphalt known only to truckers and those who made a wrong turn. Josh and Maria thought they were just taking a fun weekend drive to clear their heads. They packed snacks, made a playlist, and pointed the car toward the coast. They had no idea they were about to pick up a passenger that had been waiting there for decades. The thing they met on that road trip wasn't a person, wasn't an animal, and it wasn't a ghost. It was something else entirely, and it was watching them from the second they crossed the state line. Josh and Maria lived in a busy city, and the constant noise finally got to them. They needed silence. So they planned a drive down Route 16, a remote 2-lane road in the high desert of Nevada. Nobody lived out there. Cell service died about an hour in. That was the whole point. They wanted to see stars and feel alone. They started out easy, singing along to the radio. The sun was hot and bright, but as the afternoon faded, the landscape changed. The bright dirt turned into sharp, black rock. The sky got heavy. Route 16 wasn't beautiful. It was just empty. They pulled over to watch the sunset. The air was dead still. No wind, no sound of crickets, nothing. That silence was the first sign something was wrong. When they got back in the car, Josh noticed a spot of dirt on the passenger's side windshield. He flicked the wipers, but the spot didn't move. It wasn't on the outside. It was smeared on the inside of the glass, right where Maria was sitting. They had just cleaned the car that morning. Maria said she hadn't touched the glass. They drove on. The sun was completely gone now. The highway markers were only tiny dots of light in the blackness. Josh was focused on the road, but Maria kept glancing in the rear view mirror. She swore she could see a shape in the back seat, dark and blurry, even when there was no light behind them. When she looked hard, it was gone. Josh laughed it off, saying the darkness was playing tricks on her eyes, but then he felt the temperature drop in the car. He checked the dashboard. The air conditioning was off. The chill was sharp and wet, like stepping into a cold basement. It seemed to come only from the area behind them. They were about 4 hours into the desert drive when Maria felt a weight press down on the seat next to her. She jumped and looked over. Nothing was there. But the depression in the cushion was plain as day, like a heavy suitcase had just been set down. She started breathing fast. She grabbed Josh's arm and told him to stop the car. He slowed down, asking what was wrong. She pointed a shaking finger at the seat. He saw it too. The vinyl was visibly squashed down, smooth and deep, yet the space above it was empty. This wasn't some trick of the light. He sped up. The feeling of being watched was suddenly overwhelming. They were trapped in a metal box with something invisible. They tried talking about other things' work. Their dog, anything to break the tension, but the cold weight in the car pressed down on their words. About an hour later, the pressure intensified. Maria started to rub her neck. She said her whole head felt heavy, like someone was resting a hand on her skull. Then she screamed. Josh slammed the brakes, tires squealing on the empty road. He looked at her. Her face was pale, her eyes wide. She pointed at the glove compartment. The latch was broken. The compartment door was hanging open, and every single thing they had stored inside, the maps, the insurance card, the flashlight, was spilled onto the floor mat. They had just closed that perfectly tight before they left. Josh was shaking now. He looked over his shoulder into the back seat. He didn't see anything, but he smelled something. A scent like ozone and old pennies. The smell was so strong it burned the back of his throat. It was getting closer. He put the car in drive and floored it. He drove faster than he should have, heart pounding like a drum. The headlights were shaking on the road ahead. They needed to get out of the desert, away from Route 16, and back into any kind of civilization. As they flew down the highway, they heard a new sound. A soft, steady tap, tap, tap coming from the back window. It sounded like a long fingernail clicking against the glass. It wasn't outside, because the sound was too clear, too close. It was inside the car. Maria turned around. She didn't mean to, she just did. And she saw it. Not clearly, not like a person, but a shimmer. Like the air itself had gone thick and dark, right in the center of the back window. In that distorted blackness, she saw two white spots that looked like eyes. They weren't friendly eyes. They were focused on the back of Josh's head. She shouted his name. He didn't look. He just kept driving. The tapping grew louder, faster. The cold air was now suffocating. Maria grabbed her purse, found her keys, and started repeatedly stabbing the entity in the space where she thought it was, even though she couldn't actually see it clearly. The tapping stopped. The pressure lifted instantly. The terrible cold vanished. It was gone. The air in the car immediately felt warm and normal again. They kept driving for another hour in complete silence, not daring to look behind them. They finally made it to the coast, to a small motel. They checked into their room. They didn't even unpack. They just sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the wall. They made it. They were safe. The next morning, Josh went out to the car to get their bags. Maria stayed inside, watching the TV with the sound off. He opened the passenger door, and then he froze. Right in the center of the driver's seat, where he had been sitting, was a perfect, deep, brown burn mark. It was shaped exactly like a human handprint, burned right through the fabric and foam. It was the mark of whatever had been reaching for him all night. But that wasn't the worst part. Josh looked in the rear-view mirror, which he had bumped up when he parked. Scratched deep into the plastic housing of the mirror, where the rear-view glass was held, were 4 words, tiny and sharp: "You drove me home." They abandoned the car right there in the motel parking lot. They bought new clothes and took a bus back to the city. They never talked about Route 16 again, or what they saw, or what they felt. But they both knew it wasn't over. Maria still wakes up with a strange, heavy feeling on her skull sometimes. And every night, when Josh switches off the bedroom light, he feels a sharp drop in the temperature, and the silence in their city apartment suddenly feels deeper than the desert. The thing they picked up that night didn't stay with the car. It had found its ride home. The entity on Route 16 didn't want the car. It wanted the company. And when you're driving through total darkness, how can you ever really know what's riding right behind you? Tell us where you're listening from in the comments. If this story chilled you, hit the like button and subscribe for more Black Hour stories. This is the chilling story of the perfect getaway cabin that was never empty, and the price the lake required for their peace. Stay with us to hear what the water took from the people who rented the property. Welcome to the Black Hour Stories. Summer meant a break from everything for the Miller family. Adam, Sarah, and their teenage daughter, Chloe. They found a listing for an old, secluded cabin right on the edge of Lake Willow Creek. The photos looked incredible. Quiet water, thick woods, and a rustic stone fireplace. It looked like heaven. What the listing didn't mention was the history of the lake or the specific way the cabin earned its silence. Adam and Sarah were about to discover that this cabin was built on land that required regular, painful payments, and their daughter, Chloe, was already on the final invoice. The cabin was exactly as advertised old, smelling faintly of cedar and cold stone, and perfectly isolated. Lake Willow Creek was huge, stretching out flat and dark like a sheet of polished iron. There were no other houses visible. It was just the Millers and the water. The first few days were peaceful. Adam went fishing. Sarah read on the dock. Chloe stayed inside, complaining about the lack of Wi-Fi, but she seemed relaxed. Then the little things started. Adam noticed that every morning the screen door to the porch would be unlatched. It had a heavy bolt, and he swore he locked it every night. He started checking it 5 or 6 times before bed. But every dawn, it was swung open, tapping lightly against the wooden frame. Sarah started having strange, vivid dreams. She would dream she was standing at the edge of the lake and the water was rising. Not flooding, but rising up in a smooth, dark column right in front of her. In the dream, she could hear a sound like grinding stone and a deep, wet voice asking for a deposit. She'd wake up soaked in sweat, the sheets sticking to her skin. Chloe was the one who was truly affected. She became obsessed with the lake. She would sit for hours on the dock, just staring into the water. She usually hated nature, but she insisted the lake was talking to her. Not in words, but in a feeling, a dark, heavy pull. One afternoon, Adam was chopping wood near the back of the cabin. He saw something strange in the woodpile. It wasn't a log, but a piece of polished white bone, almost like an old piece of ivory, worked into a smooth, sharp point. It was tied with a piece of brittle, dark hair, very long hair. He felt a wave of sickness just looking at it. He quickly threw it into the deep woods, trying to forget it. That night, they were sitting by the fire, trying to play a board game. The lights started flickering wildly. The bulb didn't just flash, it pulsed like a beating heart. Then, a sudden powerful blast of cold air hit them. It smelled like deep lake mud and dead fish. The smell was so strong, Adam felt dizzy. Chloe suddenly stood up. Her eyes were wide, fixed on the stone fireplace. She didn't look like herself. She looked hollowed out and pale. She whispered, "It's time to pay." Adam rushed to her, asking what she meant. She pulled away, heading straight for the back door leading toward the lake. He grabbed her arm. Her skin was freezing cold, like she'd been standing outside in winter. He had to physically pull her back into the living room, fighting against her unexpected strength. They decided they needed to leave right then. It didn't matter if it was midnight. They had to go. As they frantically packed the trunk, Sarah went into the kitchen to grab the car keys. She stopped cold. All the cupboard doors were wide open, and every single knife, fork, and spoon was lined up perfectly on the counter. They weren't stacked. They were arranged in a single straight line, all pointing toward the back door. She ran back to Adam, telling him about the silverware. He didn't even argue. They just grabbed Chloe and ran for the car. But when Adam tried to start the car, the engine just clicked weakly. The battery was dead. He tried again and again, but there was nothing. They were stuck. They retreated back inside the cabin and locked every door and window. The silence outside was absolute, pressing in on the thin wooden walls. A deep, low sound started coming from the lake. It was a rhythmic, sucking noise, like something enormous was slowly pulling itself out of the mud. It grew louder, closer. They could hear the wet thump of weight hitting the dry ground outside. Chloe started crying, but the sound was thin, not like her usual tears. She kept whispering, "It's waiting for me. I promised." Adam looked through the small, high window facing the lake. He couldn't see anything clearly, but the surface of the water was disturbed. It was churning, not from wind, but from a powerful internal force. Then the water began to tap on the glass. Not rain, but drops of thick, oily water hitting the small window pane. They watched as the drops slowly slid down the glass. The air in the room was now heavy and wet. A cold, huge pressure hit the front door. The wood didn't splinter, but it bowed inward with a heavy, groaning sound. Whatever was outside was impossibly massive. The smell of copper and deep earth filled the small living room. Sarah saw a dark, slick finger slide under the gap at the bottom of the door. It was the color of black basalt and longer than her forearm. It was feeling around blindly, searching. Adam grabbed a cast iron frying pan from the fireplace poker set. He told Sarah to stay back. As the finger retreated, they heard a rough, wet scraping sound right against the foundation of the cabin. It was circling the building. Chloe was slumped on the floor now, pale, almost translucent. The entity was demanding its payment, and it was clear who the deposit was meant to be. Then, Adam remembered the old story he'd read in a local history book in the cabin's library. The book was about the first settlers here. It spoke of a great water spirit that gave the community fish and rain, but only if they gave it something beautiful in return every few years, something they valued. A sacrifice. Adam looked around the room in desperation. His eyes fell on Sarah's wedding ring, a thick diamond band she never took off. It was the most valuable thing they owned, a symbol of their most prized possession, their family. He didn't hesitate. He grabbed the ring from her hand. She was too terrified to protest and sprinted to the back door, yanking it open. The sucking and thumping sound stopped instantly. The black, metallic odor vanished. Adam ran to the edge of the water and hurled the ring with all his strength, sending it sailing in a bright arc over the dark lake. It hit the surface with a tiny plop and sank immediately. Silence, complete, total silence. The churning water went flat and still in an instant. The moon came out from behind the clouds, shining cold and white over the perfect, empty lake. Adam slowly walked back to the cabin. Sarah was holding Chloe, who was breathing deeply now, the terrible paleness gone. The next morning, the car started perfectly. They packed and drove away without looking back. They never returned to Lake Willow Creek, but 6 months later, back in their city home, Adam received a small wooden package in the mail. No return address. Inside, nestled on a bed of dry moss, was Sarah's wedding ring. The diamond was still sparkling, but the gold band was tarnished black and wet, covered in a thin, slimy layer of lake mud. Engraved deeply into the inside of the band, in a language he didn't recognize, was a single rough symbol. It looked exactly like the sharpened bone he had found in the woodpile. The lake didn't want the payment for all time. It just wanted a down payment, and the ring was its receipt. Some gifts from nature come with a terrible recurring invoice. The Millers paid their first fee, but that receipt proves the cabin is already expecting the next round. Tell us where you're listening from in the comments. If this story chilled you, hit the like button and subscribe for more Black Hour stories. This is the story of a childhood farm that hid a hungry secret down a deep, dark shaft, and the whispers that kept pulling people back. Stay with us to hear what Grandma knew about the well that was never empty. Welcome to the Black Hour Stories. For Mark, Grandma's farm in rural Ohio was the best place in the world. It had wide fields, a dusty barn, and a huge, dark farmhouse full of secret passages. But the one place Grandma absolutely forbade them to go was the old stone well behind the chicken coop. It was covered with a heavy steel lid locked down with 2 chains. Grandma always said the water was bad, but Mark knew she was hiding something else. He was about to discover that the well didn't hold water. It held something ancient, something that spoke, and something that had been feeding on the family history for generations. Mark and his cousins spent every summer at the farm. They were told the same rule every year: stay away from the well. It was a massive structure built from rough, gray stone, standing in the middle of a neglected field. The steel lid was thick, heavy, and rusted, secured by chains that looked like ship anchor links. One stifling hot afternoon, Mark, who was 10, and his older cousin Jake decided the rule was stupid. They found a pair of heavy-duty bolt cutters in the barn. It took them almost an hour, sweating and grunting, but they finally cut the chains. The lock fell to the dirt with a thud. The steel lid was even heavier than the chain. They managed to slide it just a few inches to the side, enough to expose a sliver of the black opening. A smell rushed out. It wasn't the smell of water or mud or rot. It smelled metallic, like copper and hot dust mixed with something sweet and sickly, like spoiled honey. Jake lowered his head closer to the gap. "I don't hear anything," he whispered. But Mark did. It was faint, like static, but it was there, and it was getting clearer. It sounded like tiny voices speaking all at once, too far away to make out the words. A buzzing cloud of whispers. Jake dared Mark to drop a rock down the shaft. Mark picked up a smooth stone and dropped it into the black hole. They waited. 1 second, 2, 3. They never heard the stone hit bottom. The well seemed to be bottomless. Then the whispers intensified. They were closer now, sounding less like static and more like actual words, but still impossible to understand. The tone was soothing, gentle, and utterly seductive. It sounded like someone calling their name, not demanding, but inviting. Mark suddenly felt a strong, deep curiosity. He wanted to look down into that blackness more than anything he had ever wanted before. He moved closer to the gap. Jake saw the look in his eyes and pulled him back. "Let's put the lid back on," Jake said, his voice shaky. They managed to force the massive lid back into place, even without the chains. They ran back to the farmhouse, telling Grandma nothing. For the rest of the week, the whispers followed Mark. They were not outside the well anymore. They were inside his head, soft and constant. "Come back. It's waiting. You want to see." One night, Mark woke up to the smell of copper and honey right in his bedroom. The whisper was clear now, like someone talking right next to his ear. It was his name, repeated over and over in a sweet, slow drawl. He climbed out of bed, feeling heavy and sleepy, and began walking toward the door. He wasn't scared. He felt drawn, like a puppet on a string. He walked through the dark, cold hallways, heading for the back door. He was almost to the door when he heard Grandma's voice, sharp and hard, from the end of the hallway. "Mark, stop right there." He froze, standing in the middle of the kitchen. Grandma was standing in the shadows, holding a heavy wooden cane. She didn't look angry. She looked terrified. She led him back to his room. She didn't scold him for going to the well. She just sat on his bed and hugged him tight, shaking. The next morning, Grandma took the two cousins out to the well. She looked tired, her face lined with worry. She brought a shovel. She didn't replace the chain. Instead, she started digging a massive hole right next to the well. When the hole was deep enough, she went into the barn and came out dragging an enormous, carved marble statue of an angel, weathered and gray. The statue had no arms, and its face was chipped away, making it look blank and watchful. She struggled to push the statue over, tipping it into the hole beside the well. She then began filling the hole with dirt, burying the blank-faced angel. Mark asked her what she was doing. Grandma stopped shoveling and looked him straight in the eye. "That well is not water, boy. It's a door. And the whispers aren't asking you for water. They are asking for quiet neighbors. The first one who came here built that well to seal something in, but the whispers are too strong now. They call people to stand over the edge and stare in, and they feed on the pure sight of a soul looking down." She wiped sweat from her forehead. That statue was supposed to keep the thing quiet, but the sound of its carving, the clink, clink, clink of the chisel, made the thing inside angry. It started calling for the sculptors. They all went to the well. Every single one. She explained that generations of her family had been tempted by the whispers. Her own brother had gone to look down the shaft 30 years ago and never came back. His body was never found. It was as if the ground itself swallowed him. "When you hear it," she said, pointing the shovel at him, "you look away. You make noise. You break the pull. You never, ever look down." She finished burying the angel, packing the dirt tight. She then poured a bucket of thick, wet salt all around the well's base. That night, the house was full of sound. Not just the normal sounds of an old farmhouse settling, but powerful, deep scratching noises coming from outside right next to the well. The walls of the house groaned. They could hear the sound of the dirt being pushed and scraped away, and a terrible, frustrated sigh that seemed to roll right across the fields. The whispers in Mark's head were replaced by a roaring, screaming sound that was like every word he had ever heard, played backward and loud. It was pure, frantic rage. The next morning, the well was still there, but the earth around it looked strange. The salt Grandma had poured was gone, absorbed into the ground. Where the angel statue had been buried, the ground was disturbed, pushed up in a rough, high mound. The chains and the heavy steel lid were lying 20 feet away in the field. The well was wide open, a gaping circle of blackness. They packed up and left the farm immediately. Grandma stayed behind, her face set like stone. Mark never went back. But years later, when he was in college, he received a thick, yellowed letter from a country lawyer. Grandma had died. The letter explained that Mark had inherited the farm, but the letter had one strange, small detail underlined in shaky handwriting by his grandmother. "Do not, under any circumstances, use the well." Mark thought about selling the farm immediately. But the night he decided to call the realtor, he stood by his kitchen sink, and he smelled it again, metallic copper and spoiled honey. And a whisper, soft and inviting, started spinning in the back of his mind. He is not afraid anymore. He is only curious. Sometimes when he is alone, he stands in his apartment, stares into his own darkened reflection, and listens to the sweet, slow voice telling him to just come home, look down, and see what's waiting for him. The well is quiet now. It knows he is coming back soon. The things that are hungry are often the most patient. And sometimes the only thing keeping a doorway shut is a whisper that you just can't resist. Tell us where you're listening from in the comments. If this story chilled you, hit the like button and subscribe for more Black Hour stories.